Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we discussed the organized attempt on the part of the native intelligentsia to prove that Indian traditional values are as contemporary and scientific like any modern epistemologies. We saw that there were two major ways in which attempts were made to prove the modernity of Indian tradition. The first approach sought validation outside the framework of Western rationalism. This method was based on the assumption that Western rationalist framework cannot effectively explain the Indian tradition in an effective manner because it lies beyond the comprehension of modern science and technology. This method relied on actual lived experience to demonstrate the efficacy of Indian traditions. In such cases, traditional knowledge, whether astrology, Ayurveda, or Sanskrit poetics, was not just justified through Western scientific reasoning, but through its direct impact on people's lives. The idea was that the systems were valid in their own right and did not need approval from Western epistemology. The second approach attempted to prove the efficacy of traditional knowledge systems by placing them in direct comparison or conversation with Western counterparts. Scholars argued that Indian intellectual traditions such as Sanskrit poetics in literature or Ayurveda in medicine were as sophisticated and modern as the Western disciplines by identifying the common interfaces between traditional knowledge systems and their Western counterparts. However, this strategy often resulted in an unintended paradox. While trying to decolonize knowledge, it continued to rely on Western frameworks as a benchmark for legitimacy. Both approaches, though different in methodology, shared a common goal: to assert that Indian tradition was not outdated but a very dynamic and modern system of thought. These efforts were not merely academic exercises but were deeply tied to the nationalist aspirations as they sought to challenge colonial narratives and reaffirm India's intellectual and cultural heritage. Attempts were also made to prove that Indian prehistoric period is not mythical or fictional but true and authentic. In this lecture, we are going to examine the way in which colonial masters dealt with the question of classical knowledge. As far as the classical learning was concerned, one can notice two major trends in the colonial period. One was the dissemination of the knowledge about classical epistemologies, and the other was the reconstruction of many classical texts from India's past from the available fragments. First, let's take a look at the process of the dissemination of knowledge about classical works. The dissemination of the knowledge about classical works happened primarily through the translation of these texts into English and other vernacular languages. The vital force behind this process was obviously the publishers of classical series such as Bibliotheca Indica, Gaikwad Oriental Series, Nirnaya Sagar Press, Motilal Banarasidas, Anandashram Sanskrit Series, Trivandrum Sanskrit Series, and so on. They published a lot of rare Sanskrit books which were available only in manuscript form till then. The translations of many key texts in classical studies into English and other vernacular languages played a vital role in disseminating knowledge about this field among modern scholars who could not read and understand the original texts written in Sanskrit. These translations of key classical texts significantly contributed to making knowledge more accessible to a wider audience. The translation of these texts also facilitated the scholars to engage with classical studies beyond traditional Sanskrit scholars. This has not only enabled the broader dissemination of ideas, but has also enriched newer fields of knowledge like comparative studies, interdisciplinary research, and the integration of classical Indian thought into global intellectual scenario or discourses. Above all, translations also played a crucial role in the democratization of traditional knowledge. In the past, many important classical texts were written in Sanskrit, which was a language that not everybody could read or understand. As a result, these texts were mostly studied by a small group of scholars and elites. However, when these texts were translated into English and other regional languages, more people could read and engage with them. This helped spread knowledge and allowed students, researchers, and the general public to learn from these classical works. Instead of being restricted to a few, classical ideas became available to a much larger audience. This was a very significant epistemological shift that was taking place in the realm of classical studies in colonial India. During this period, the spaces of learning also underwent a radical transformation. New institutions were established for the study and preservation of Indian knowledge systems. One of the key initiatives was the Banaras Sanskrit College, which was established by Jonathan Duncan in 1784. The Banaras Sanskrit College promoted Sanskrit learning and Hindu philosophy. Another major institution meant for the promotion of classical knowledge was the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Established by William Jones in 1791, Asiatic Society of Bengal became a center for researching Indian history, languages, and literature. These significant institutions played a vital role in shaping and molding the study of classical texts during the colonial period. They helped to bridge Indian and European scholarship and influenced the translation and interpretation of classical works. Yet another major event in the field of classical learning was the reconstruction of many classical texts that were thought to be lost forever. Here, we should particularly need to note that although the attempts to reconstruct the classical past started in the colonial period, the completion of many of these activities happened only during the post-colonial period. A glance at the various stages through which Kundaga's Vakrokti Jivita, a seminal text in Sanskrit poetics, was reconstructed, bears testimony to the amount of energy and meticulous research that went into this process. Kundaga's Vakrokti Jivita, which was long thought to be lost and known only through the citations in the later texts of Kavya Shastra, is now available to us primarily through the efforts of S.K. De and Krishnamurti. S.K. De brought out a copy of Kundaga's Vakrokti Jivita in 1923 based on two Devanagari transcripts of a Malayalam manuscript, which was also lost at some point, from the Oriental Manuscripts Library, Madras. The manuscript seemed to have contained 4 chapters, but the last chapter in the manuscript broke off without any conclusion. The 3rd chapter also contained a lot of gaps in it, so they was unable to publish a reasonable text, a readable text. However, he brought out an edition of Kundaga's Vakrokti Jivita with the first 2 chapters and a resume of the contents of the last 2 chapters. This arrangement was still necessary even in the 2nd edition in 1928, when a new edition of Vakrokti Jivita was brought out after a new manuscript was found in Jaisalmer. Despite these limitations, his edition was quite crucial in introducing Kundaga's idea of Vakrokti to the readers of modern India. A coherent and readable text of Vakrokti Jivita, along with a translation, came out only in 1977 through the efforts of Krishnamurti. For this edition, Krishnamurti collected a transcript of the last 2 chapters of the manuscript, Madras manuscript, and combined it with the same portions of the new Jaisalmer manuscript and the Vakrokti Jivita extracts in the Kalpalata Viveka. For the first two chapters, he made use of the Jaisalmer manuscript along with Day's 1928 edition. These efforts finally came to fruition in the form of a readable text for Vakrokti Jivita. Almost all other key texts of classical learning that we now have access to have gone through a similar process of editing and careful textual scrutiny. I explained the various stages through which Vakrokti Jivita was reconstructed, first in the colonial period and later in the post-colonial period, just to give you a sense of the meticulous attention that had gone into the reconstruction of classical texts during the colonial period. Colonial scholars gave a lot of importance to Sanskrit texts to the point of treating them as the sole representatives of Indian knowledge. Such an approach, even though it resulted in the dissemination and democratization of knowledge about classical epistemologies, often led to the neglect of many traditions in the vernacular languages like Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Bengali, Marathi, and so on which had equally valuable philosophical, literary, and scientific works. For example, while Sanskrit texts like the manuscripts or the Vedas were thoroughly translated and studied, traditions like Bhakti poetry and regional historical accounts received very less attention. In short, the colonial masters who were interested in the Oriental knowledge could give only an incomplete picture of India's intellectual tradition. We should here particularly note that the love of the colonial masters for Sanskrit and other classical epistemologies was not without any ulterior motives. As the East India Company held considerable sway over different parts of India, it became necessary for the colonial administrators to understand Indian customs and traditions to manage the colony effectively. This led them to study many Indic languages like Sanskrit, Persian, Bengali, Tamil, and other Indian languages. Many of these colonial administrators even wrote grammar books in English to help others learn these languages. We should here particularly need to note that the European interpretation of India's past was deeply influenced by colonial interests as well as European ideas about history, civilization, and the East. Although the Orientalist scholars in the colonial machinery worked closely with Indian scholars to study classical languages and texts, they hardly made any strong attempt to understand the cultural perspectives of the traditional preceptors who were teaching them. As a result, their interpretations were often lopsided or often disconnected from the traditional Indian ways of understanding the past. One such prominent European notion about Indian history was that Indian society was progressively declining from its apotheosis of glory. European historians and the Orientalist historians saw early India as once glorious, while the contemporary Indian as degenerated. G. N. Devi's observations is a case in point in this context. In his After Amnesia, Devi observes the attitude of history implicit in Indological works ranging from Halhead's Grammar of Bengali to Max Muller's India, What Can It Teach Us, considers Indian heritage as once glorious but now decadent force. The European historians, especially those with the Orientalist lineage, held the view that there is nothing in contemporary India that is worth preserving. During the course of time, the colonial perspectives on history became dominant through print capitalism, university education, and school curricula. The widespread printing of colonial histories of India's past and civilizations shaped even the natives' perspectives about their own past. Educational institutions such as schools and universities, designed along Western interests, often reinforced this interpretation by teaching Indian history through a European lens. As a result, the native Indians slowly began to view their own history and culture through the framework set by the colonial scholars. We should also need to note that for the colonial historiographers, the idea of classical almost meant two things: one early India and the other Sanskrit. So, the learning of classic was primarily the study of Sanskrit texts from the early period. Even when the Sanskritic knowledge systems were made part of the university and school curriculum, the texts were primarily chosen from the early period. Rarely texts were chosen from the medieval period, and there were hardly any texts from the contemporary colonial period. This conception also stems from the Orientalist assumption that India underwent a serious cultural crisis after the early period. But the historical facts prove this wrong. Sheldon Pollock observes, the 2 centuries before European colonialism decisively established itself in the subcontinent around 1750 constitute one of the most innovative epochs of Sanskrit systematic thought. He mentions this in language analysis, logic, hermeneutics, moral, legal philosophy, and the rest. Thinkers produced new formulations of old problems in entirely new discursive idioms in what were often new scholarly genres, employing often a new historicist framework. Some even called themselves the new scholars or Navyas. Concurrently with the spread of European power, however, this dynamism diminished so much that by 1800 the capacity of Sanskrit thought to make history had vanished. The production of moral legal texts, for example, which was so extensive throughout the 17th century, ceased entirely. And in core disciplines like hermeneutics or literary theory, no significant scholarship, that is, significant in the eyes of tradition itself, was again to be written. What this shows is that classical knowledge systems in early India have always been vibrant and evolving. Even though Orientalist historians often presented them in a way that suited colonial narratives, these scholars viewed Indian knowledge as something ancient, static, and in decline, rather than recognizing its continuous development. In reality, India's intellectual landscape was shaped by ongoing debates, reinterpretations, and innovations across different time periods. Yuval Bronner's observation deserves special attention in this context. Bronner, in his essay What is New and What is Navya, challenges this Orientalist conception by highlighting the innovations in the field of literary theory. Bronner opens his essay by pointing out that modern views on Sanskrit poetics are often biased and focus only on key figures from the early period like Anandavardhana. According to Bronner, the Orientalist perspective overlooked the later pre-colonial texts and failed to carefully and objectively examine them. He opines that many modern scholars see the work of later literary theoreticians as simply redundant. One Indologist, Bronner continues, maintains that by the 16th century, the age of really original, thoughtful writers was long gone by. Bronner's essay is a refutation of this popular conception. According to Bronner, the literary theoreticians in the medieval period or phase attempted to constitute a new relation with their past. Instead of inventing any radically new critical concept like Dhwani or Vakrokti, they directed their energy mainly to critically examine the views of their predecessors and to answer the old questions in new ways, to mark their departure from their predecessors in terms of their mode of operation and views. These new poeticians often identified themselves as Navyas or new, in contrast to their antecedents who they called Prachinas. There are numerous examples for Sanskrit literary theoreticians from the medieval period creatively engaging with the works of their predecessors. A few cases in this regard include Siddhachandra's Kavya Prakasha Khandana, Appaya Dikshida's Chitra Mimamsa and Kuvalayananda, and Jagannatha's Rasa Gangadhara and Chitra Mimamsa Khandana. These remarkable treatises from the medieval period meticulously attack the claims of their predecessors and come up with innovative approaches. We have almost reached the fag end of today's lecture. I will wind up today's lecture by talking about a different conception about India's classical culture endorsed by the Anglicists like James Mill and Orientalists like William Jones. While the Orientalists viewed classical literature from the early period of India as the high watermark of India's cultural legacy, for many Anglicists like James Mill, classical texts were embodiments of immorality in Indian culture. James Mill strongly believed that Indian society was backward and irrational, and Sanskrit literature was a reflection of lazy and unproductive culture. For example, James Mill viewed certain elements in Abhijnana Shakuntalam, like the Gandharva marriage, where lovers marry without rituals, Durvasa's curse, etc., as signs of India's superstition and decline. While William Jones admired the supreme craft of Abhijnana Shakuntalam and praised Kalidasa, the Shakespeare of India, Mill thought that classics like Shakuntalam did not have much utilitarian value. He dismissed Shakuntalam as shallow and naive and held the view that Jones gave into the seductive beauty of the play. Mill indeed shared the view of Jones that Abhijnana Shakuntalam was a beautiful pastoral play, but he believed that the pastoral literature was written by young or undeveloped societies where people lived under oppressive rulers. According to Mill, these societies, instead of engaging in serious political or social thought, escaped into light-hearted romances. In other words, Mill considered classical works like Shakuntalam as a sign of India's backwardness rather than a reflection of its greatness. Gauri Vishwanathan, in her Mass of Conquest, says the social values that Shakuntala celebrates, superstition, extravagant belief, and arbitrary will, appear to prove Mill's point. He interpreted exaggeration in art as a reflection of inconsistencies in the laws and institutions of the society from which it springs and for which it is intended. A social practice that he found irreconcilable with the notion of a refined people is the marriage that takes place in the forest between the hero and the heroine in Shakuntala. Or, in other words, that kind of marriage which two lovers contract from the desire of amorous embraces. You will be surprised to note that an Indian classic like Abhijnana Shakuntalam was thought to be unfit for teaching in classrooms for a long time in the colonial context. The major criticism against popular form of Indian literature was that they were filled with immorality and impurity. They were of the view that Indian mind was not matured enough to distinguish between what was decent and indecent, and they may get corrupt by reading classical literature which contained elements that were at war with the Victorian morality. Gauri Vishwanathan's words in her famous work The Masks of Conquest in this respect merit attention here. According to her, a play like Kalidasa's Shakuntalam, which delighted the Europeans for its pastoral beauty and lyric charm, and led Horace Wilson, a major 19th century Sanskrit scholar, to call it the jewel of Indian literature, was disapproved of as a text for study in Indian schools and colleges, and the judgment that the more popular forms of Oriental literature are marked with the greatest immorality and impurity held sway. The inability to discriminate between decency and indecency was deemed to be a fixed characteristic of the native mind, a symptom of the dullness of their comprehension. Clearly, such a statement suggests that it is not the morality of literature that is at issue, but the mental capabilities of the reader. Raising Indians to the intellectual level of their Western counterparts constituted a necessary prerequisite to literary instruction, especially in texts from the native culture, and consequently to forestalling the danger of having unfortified minds falsely seduced by the impurities of the traditional literature of the East. Now, let's wind up the class by summarizing all the major ideas that we discussed so far. As far as the classical learning was concerned, one can notice two major trends in the colonial period. One was the dissemination of the knowledge about classical epistemologies, and the second was the reconstruction of many classical texts from the available fragments. These translations of the key classical texts significantly contributed to making knowledge more accessible to a wider audience. The translation of these texts also facilitated the scholars to engage with classical studies beyond traditional Sanskrit scholars. This has not only enabled the broader dissemination of ideas, but has also enriched newer fields of knowledge like comparative studies, interdisciplinary research, and the integration of classical Indian thought into global intellectual discourses and thoughts. Above all, translations also played a crucial role in democratizing the knowledge about classics. In the past, many important classical texts were written in Sanskrit, a language that not everyone could read or understand or appreciate. As a result, these texts were mostly studied by a small group of scholars and elites. However, when these texts were translated into English and other regional languages, more people could read and engage with them. This helped spread knowledge and allowed students, researchers, and the general public to learn from these classical works. Instead of being restricted to a few classical ideas, became available to a much larger audience. This was a significant epistemological shift that was taking place in the realm of classical studies in colonial India. During this period, the spaces of learning also underwent radical transformation. New institutions in the form of schools and universities were established for the study and preservation of Indian knowledge systems. We should here particularly need to note that the European interpretation of India's past was deeply influenced by colonial interests as well as European ideas about history, civilization, and the East. Although the Orientalist scholars in the colonial machinery worked closely with Indian scholars to study classical languages and texts, they hardly made any proper attempt to understand the cultural perspectives of the traditional preceptors who were teaching them. We should also need to note that during the colonial period, for the colonial historiographers, the idea of classical meant two things, one the early India and the other Sanskrit. So, the learning of classic was primarily the study of Sanskrit texts from the early period. Even when the Sanskritic knowledge systems were made part of the university and school curriculum, the texts were mainly chosen from the early period. Rarely texts were chosen from the medieval period, and hardly were there any texts from the contemporary colonial period. I hope you have understood all the major lessons that we discussed so far. Thank you.